Hello, this is Joseph Cook. Welcome to part 8 of the series Freedom Through Travel. Today we look at Southeast Asia, and specifically Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam. I arrived in Bangkok, and I thought when I arrived there it was one of the wealthiest cities in the world. But that was in comparison to where I had been the last month, which was India and Nepal. I arrived in Ko Samet Road. I would go to Ko Samet Road, is where most of the backpackers go when they arrive in Bangkok. And because it was late, I just kind of went to bed that night. But the following day, I kind of took a short tour of Bangkok. And the first place I go is north of Ko Samet Road, which is a democracy monument, and then head east, which has a series of temples or wats. They're all fairly similar, as they have the red, yellow, and orange coloring. But there's a couple that really stood out. The one that I liked was one in which there was a ceremony in front of it, a graduation ceremony. I'm not sure if it was from like a high school or a college, but it was kind of a nice place to take your picture in front of. And this particular monument stood right next to the royal palace. Thailand does have a king who's revered in the country, but they also, real power is held by the leader, the prime minister. So it is a democratic nation. But there's some impressive gardens to look at in the royal palace area. And then I go to Ko Samet, which is an island. There's a series of islands. Koh Phangan is probably the most famous. It's the one famous for its kind of wild moon festivals, full moon festivals. But this one is an easy day trip from Bangkok, and a lot of people do go there. A lot of tourists go there. And this is much more relaxing than the busy streets of Bangkok, as there's only one road in Ko Samet, and that's a dirt road that really actually breaks down by the time you reach the southern part of the island. So there's just trucks going back and forth, and you have to walk the rest of the way. But I had fun relaxing on the beach and sharing stories with other tourists while I was there, and eating pineapples and coconuts. There was a couple docks, one on the north end where most people go to, or most boats go to, and then one on the east side, which is deteriorating. I also had a chance to stay in a small bungalow, my own private bungalow. This is this very small house, and it was nice not to have to go to a hotel or a hostel and worry about other people. I was there all by myself. Even though it was really small, it was nice to stay there. And then I took the boat back. You have to take a boat ride back to the mainland of Thailand, and then we took a minivan back to Bangkok. Back in Bangkok, I again got used to the traffic. It's much different than Ko Samet. And I took a walk down the snake farm. I was kind of surprised how huge these snakes were and how insecure, I guess, the cages were. It was just a small latch that you could just pull up, and the snakes could get out. But it was interesting to look at these snakes, and they also had a small museum inside that showed some of the snake skins, and it was impressive to see a snake skin run the whole length of a wall. And then I went up to Chiang Mai. This is in the northern part of Bangkok. I took a train up there. It was a 17-hour train ride, but I slept pretty well. And the view gets really nice as you move towards Chiang Mai in the north. Chiang Mai and Chiang Rai are the more populous cities up here. Chiang Mai is actually the second biggest city in Thailand, behind Bangkok. And it's a pretty attractive city to be in. There's a large square in the middle, in the central square, that's surrounded by a moat. And most of the activities, at least tourist activities, are there. And there's also a pretty lively night bazaar within the square where you can buy a lot of different things. And the main temple to see here in Chiang Mai is the Wat Phra Singh. This is a very large and very colorful Wat, or temple. Inside there's a bronze Buddha from the 15th century, and on the walls there's murals of life, typical life in Thailand from 100 years ago. But the main reason most tourists go to Chiang Mai, besides the city, is to take a trek to see some of the nearby villages. And that's the reason why I went there, to see the Hmong and the Khmer people. So I got arranged a tour, and we took a truck up there with a couple other tourists. And on the way, we stopped for something to eat. And one of the things I noticed was chicken feet as something to eat right next to the rest of the chicken, the breasts and the wings. And apparently you eat these chicken feet much like you eat a crawfish, where you crack it apart and then suck out the juices and eat any meat that you do have. There's other things, other food in Thailand that I'll talk about a little bit later. But then we did make it up to we started off on the first village, which would have been the Hmong village. And as soon as we got out of the truck, it started to rain, and it didn't stop until 3 days later when we got back on the truck. So it was a really hard rain, and it made it for a very difficult trek. And actually, 2 people in our group actually went back because of falling down so many times and just being drenched. But we eventually did make it to the Hmong village, and our accommodations were it was a bit drafty there, and it was also a bit muddy, so it was dirt floor, so we didn't really have a good chance to relax there or dry out at all. But the Hmong people actually has a fairly large population here. It's 100,000 people in Thailand, and it has a large population here in the United States, especially in the states of California, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. These were the people that assisted the U.S. in the U.S.-Vietnamese War, and that's a reason for the immigration policy. As I said, it was very, very rainy, and we ended up getting pretty muddy. I did fall down a couple times because of the mud, and it was just gushing water, actually. We were helped a little bit by an elephant ride. We were able to get on an elephant, and they took us up a couple hills. And it was pretty impressive to see the elephants take just basically a tree, a very small tree, but basically just wrap around it and tear it from its roots. And for some reason, they really liked the trees. The next place we went to, the next village we went to the next day was the Karen village. This was quite a bit different. Our accommodations were quite a bit better. We had wooden floors, and it wasn't quite as drafty, and just all the other villagers' accommodations were quite a bit better also. There's 2 different types of Karen people, the short-necked and the long-necked. We stayed by the short-necked, but the long-necked are farther north, and that's the one you might see in pictures where it looks like a neck brace, actually, where their necks are extended, but it's kind of gold rings. And apparently, I'm not sure if this is true, but if you would take, after a few years, if you would take that neck brace-looking thing out, their necks might snap and break, actually. But anyways, we stay by the short necks, like I said, and there's 350,000 Karen people in Thailand. They came from the 7th century. They came from Burma and China and came to Thailand. They do not live with their extended family, rather, and the unmarried women wear white dresses while the married women wear red and blue. Further, the men wear similar colors, but they wear pants instead of the dresses. One of the common things to do at these villages is give gifts. They prepare the food for you, the rice and everything like that, but you're also supposed to give gifts at times. I gave pens. That's a common thing to see in many of these countries, little kids coming up to you and making a writing motion. That's due to them going to school but maybe not having enough money to afford pens. And so pens is a big one. Others gave balloons also, which is a popular one gift to give. And they actually were waiting for us as we left to say goodbye, but it was kind of difficult because of the language barrier. The only person that could understand both languages is the tour guide, so you can't really say much more than hello. And because of the rain and the tough walk, we weren't really in a mood to socialize anyways. And so we continued our trek, and we went along through the rice paddies, and we were crossed by many different animals such as pigs. And eventually we made it to an area of the river that had a bamboo raft. And I was a bit concerned because I don't swim. But I got on the bamboo, and you're immediately, once you step on the bamboo, you're under like an inch of water because it sinks a little bit. But we made it down the river, and it was better than walking, and then we made it to our truck, and we were able to make it back. And we continued back. We did make a pit stop at some mountain temples. And these were impressive temples to look at because of how high they were, and there's the mist color, or there's mist also that kind of accentuated the color, the purple color of the temples. And then we went through Chiang Mai, back into Chiang Mai, which is actually a good way to get a tour of the city of Chiang Mai and what it was like. Even though I was tired that day, I decided to go to a kickboxing competition. There's other tourists that wanted to go, so I went. And this was a bit different than I thought. I thought it would be really bloody, but there's no blood, there's no knockouts. They actually stop the fight if someone can't defend themselves. I had a preconceived notion of what it would be like. But the fights basically there's two fights. These were the first two fights were the 60-pounders. And these were really young kids, like 10, 12 years old. Those were the first two. And then there's 6 other fights that are probably more upper teenager to early 20s that were fighting, and there's the main event. One of the things that I thought was kind of interesting was how rhythmic it was. There was I won't really call them a band, but there was a couple people that were playing musical instruments in the background, kind of drums, and it would be a constant beat. And the participants would either kick or punch based on this rhythm. It was very rhythmic, going back and forth. And they also gave a kind of a neat ritual before the actual fight, where they would, it's about 30 seconds long to a minute, where they would kind of pay homage to their coaches and those that came before them. The next place I visited was the Grand Palace. This is back in Bangkok. As you walk into the area that's called the Grand Palace, for about a kilometer in the arcades, which run inside the walls, the murals there's a set of murals, and it shows ancient Hindu history. There's some 178 panels as you go around. Then the next thing that you see, there's a lot of different things I guess you notice, but the most important thing that you see is the Wat that holds the Emerald Buddha. This is one of the most important things in Bangkok. There's 8 boundary stones around the Emerald Buddha, each sheltering a fairy castle. The walls of the Wat itself are sparkled with colored glass and are supported by 112 golden birdmen holding mythical serpents. Inside, a pedestal supports the tiny 60-centimeter jade Emerald Buddha. It's a sacred figure renowned for its miraculous powers. The king ceremonially changes the statue's costume according to the season. Like I said, there's several other temples that you can see within this area. The temple occupies the northeast corner of the huge Grand Palace, which dates back to 1785, but it's now open for state functions. It's only used for state functions. And the next thing that I saw after I saw the Grand Palace and the Wat, is there's another Wat that's fairly close. It's called Wat Po. And this is famous for the reclining Buddha that's within it. The Wat Po was created in 1832, or was turned into Thailand's first university by decorating the walls with diagrams on subjects such as history, literature, and animal husbandry. The Wat is still a center of traditional medicine, but like I said, it is dominated by this huge reclining Buddha. There's also a fairly important temple across the riverway. A nice way to go around Bangkok is by boats rather than by tuk-tuks or taxis. So I took a boat across, and the Temple of Dawn has mythical figures that support the levels, along with Buddha at 4 important parts of his life. The next part of the trip in Thailand is a tour that I took, an organized tour that takes you the area around Bangkok. The first thing they show you is this coconut farm. Basically, it shows the coconut process. This is kind of more of a tourist trap more than anything else. But the next thing that we saw after that was something I really enjoyed, was the floating markets. These are open from 6 to 11, but most tourist groups don't get there until after 9, which is when we got there. But the real action happens from 6 to 9 when you have the true locals at the market. And these are floating markets. They have, the merchants have what they're selling on their boat, and they go back and forth small riverways and try to sell you something. And basically, you stand next to the river and shout out what you want or point out what you want, and they'll hold it up, and then you hold up money and you work it out, and then you pass the money across the boats, and it gets passed back and forth, and it works out. So this is really an interesting place. I don't know how well they can compete at this particular spot, because there's many really big shops right next to them, and I'm sure they can get a better price, but it was interesting to bargain back and forth with them. Continuing on the tour, we went to an area, artisan shop basically. It's where they made sculptures out of teak wood, and these were very, very impressive, but out of my price range. These are all a couple $1,000s, but it was interesting to see the meticulous work that they had here. And the next part of it is the River Kwai. This is important for historical region. The bridge over the River Kwai is important for historical reasons. This was bombed in World War II. This was part of the Japanese effort to make a railway from Singapore up into Burma, which is lands that they had conquered in World War II. This is part of the Burma Death March, in which 16,000 POWs and 100,000 Asian laborers died. As for the bridge itself, it's fairly nondescript. It's not really that interesting, but it's interesting as far as the reason why it's interesting is because of the historical relevance. And the last place we visited on this tour was the largest temple in Thailand. And again, the temple is kind of impressive, but what was really more interesting was the area around it, which was a series of markets. And this is where you could buy, like I talked about the food before, you could buy many different kinds of food, like you could buy grasshopper or spiders, and these are all fried grasshoppers or fried spiders. So that made, and you can also do that at Ko Samet Road, which, like I said, is the main backpacker place where I stayed. There's similar kind of foods. Pad Thai and egg rolls are kind of the staple foods, but there's other foods you can try. So that was the end of Thailand. I then moved to Cambodia. And I could definitely tell when Thailand ended and Cambodia started, not just because of the immigration, but because of the road systems. It's quite a bit different. The first place I went to in Siem Reap is Angkor Wat. This is actually just outside the city of Angkor. You hire someone, usually a young man that drives around little Honda mopeds, and will show you around for $5 the whole day. Angkor Wat is the most impressive temple within the Angkor Wat complex. It's built in the 12th century as a mausoleum, and it represents the height of inspiration and perfection in Khmer art. You can approach, most people approach along the sandstone causeway across a broad moat and through the western gate, and then you can see bits of the central towers. And then after going through the causeway, you could see the actual central towers. They're very distinctive towers. They're designed to look like the lotus buds, and there's 4 smaller towers around the taller central one, and it's something that really stands out. The temple is made up of 3 platforms linked by stairways, and long column galleries extend outward from the central area. There's several other terraces that you could go through and galleries that you go to within this area, gallery of 1,000 Buddhas and a terrace of honor. But the Angkor Wat is definitely the most important. But very close to the Angkor Wat is Angkor Thom. This is probably the second most important. This is directly north of Angkor Wat. And this was the last and greatest capital of the Angkor era. This is the late 12th century into the early 13th century. The city is enclosed by 4 defensive walls, 8 meters high and 3 kilometers long on each side. This is surrounded by a moat, then surrounded by a 100-meter wide moat also. What's kind of interesting as you go into the area is the Temple of Bopan. And the reason why it's impressive is it's Bayan is the name of it. This is at the center of Angkor Thom, and even though it doesn't have very good workmanship, it really does stand out because it has 4 large carved faces, and they're looking out in each direction. And there's some debate over who this is supposed to represent, but it's one of the symbols of Angkor Thom. One of the things I noticed when we were walking around is all the children that were selling us water or Pringles or whatever, and they'd always say, "Hey, mister, you want to buy something, cold drink?" And one of the things that I thought odd was, well, first of all, they obviously weren't in school, and they're probably having trouble with trying to make enough money to live, basically. But I noticed how friendly most of the Cambodians were. It's really a bit odd. It's almost like they're all on ecstasy or something like that. Like you would talk to them just for like 5 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes, and they'd be rubbing your legs or rubbing your shoulders or whatever. And it wasn't like in a sexual manner. It was both young men and young women. But it was really odd how friendly they were towards Westerners. I think maybe that's because there wasn't a lot of Westerners that have come to Cambodia lately, just because of the problems in that country. One of the ones, another temple I liked, there's a series of temples that I really liked. One was east of Angkor Wat. This is the one that really stuck out because of the crickets that were in the background. It was really loud crickets, and it was kind of an eerie feeling because the crickets, along with all the landmines haven't been cleared out of Cambodia, and even in this area, the Angkor Wat area, which is heavily, populated, people go to it, there's still not all the landmines cleared up. You'd have to go stray quite a ways away from the main temples to even have a possibility of stepping on a landmine, but it's still kind of, I guess it's kind of a rush, and this was really accentuated by the crickets. For some reason, it was a weird noise. But we returned back to another temple, and we stopped by a family, and again, this is what I was saying before about how friendly people were. They waved us over, and they offered us their beer and their food and everything. And this is kind of surprising for the fact that most Cambodians make about $15 a month, and to offer their food and drink to someone they didn't even know was surprising. And we also stayed by a family that we really liked. This particular family, the mother was 20 years old and the daughter was just 7. But there's a series of young kids out there that we like to play with, and they made us food. They had like a small restaurant too. I wouldn't really call it a restaurant, but that's how they made money. And we returned there every day, actually, just because we enjoyed them. After we ate, we went back to some more temples. One of the ones that, or actually most of them were very steep. You had to really watch yourself, and if it was slippery, you might fall. One of the ones I really liked is it's called Tab Pram. The reason why I liked it is because basically they let the trees grow, and it's really odd to see. It's a bit magical effect because the trees just grow right into the temples, and unfortunately it's starting to break it apart. But it's really a neat visual effect to see that. Stopping at the next temple, we stop at a woman who was trying to learn English, and we looked at her English book, and they had some lines like, "I would like to buy some tax-free items." I'm surprised that's what they're teaching in English. That just seems like a useless statement. But anyways, we talked to her a little bit, and she practiced her English. And we went through another one that was near a lake, and it was pretty hot here in Cambodia, so a lot of people were actually taking a dip into the lake and really enjoying cooling off. Some of them were enjoying it maybe a little bit too much, but the next one we went to was actually located in a farmer's backyard, basically. And this is where we noticed some of the more children. They're playing a kick shoe game where they kick their shoes, or I guess it would be sandals, really. I don't really understand totally, but I think you're trying to get your two sandals the closest. But it would seem like a tough, that you might stub your feet. But in the last temple we went to on the first day was another temple. Again, we met a bunch of kids that were sitting there, and we tried to do the thing where you try to make kind of like glasses with your hands. And this is something, again, like I said, that I don't think they're used to Westerners, because it's a pretty simple thing to do, but it took one of the children about 5 minutes to do it, and basically he needed help from his bigger brother. But one of the things that I really remember is all the children on there that we played with. It was kind of fun to play with them because they weren't used to so many of our practices, I think. A nice vision also of Angkor Wat, the actual temple, is from Banam Pakeng. This is a temple that you have to climb up, basically. And from this climb, it's very high up, but once you climb up it, you can get a nice overview of actually Siem Reap. But this is where you can really tell how impressive Angkor Wat is, because located within the jungle, you see these this tower of Angkor Wat, and really stands out. And a lot of people go there at sunset. The next day we looked at some more temples, and we returned to our favorite family that I talked about before to eat. And they showed us how ice is broken down here in Cambodia. Basically, someone comes with a big truck of ice, a big slab of it, and they cut it down. And then the family here macheted it down into little cubes of ice, and that's how they did it. Also, the little 7-year-old girl was working on the roof. This must be fairly common with all the rain, that they probably have to repair it on a regular basis. And then they said goodbye to us and see you next year, but that didn't happen. I didn't see them next year. But we waved goodbye, and that was the last temples that we saw in Angkor Wat. After that, I moved on from Siem Reap to Phnom Penh, which is the capital. And the easiest way, or the best way, to go from Siem Reap to Phnom Penh is by boat. And if the water level's high enough, you can do that, and that's what I did. It took 4 hours, which is pretty good, because a bus trip, if it doesn't go well, it could take up to a couple days. So this was definitely the best way to do it, and you also get a view of some of the houses on the lake, some of the kind of stilt houses, elevated stilt houses. And we went on a boat that's kind of like a canal boat in Amsterdam. We were forced to sit on the roof. The locals are smart enough to get in early and get onto the under the covered area on the inside. But we all sat on the roof, but it was a really warm day, and it was sunny, so it didn't matter. And arriving in Phnom Penh, we will go to the Royal Palace. This is located within Phnom Penh, and this is a fairly important area. This is where the king resides, actually. You can't, and if there's a blue flag, you can tell that the king is in residence, but you aren't allowed to actually see the area that the king stays in, even if he is in residence. So it's strictly off limits. But there's several buildings within the complex that you could see that are interesting anyways. And probably the most important is the Silver Pagoda. This is another small emerald Buddha, like the one we saw in Bangkok, is located there. And there's also depictions, artwork there from the 1903 to 1904 that has some Khmer history within it. So even if you don't see the actual residence or the throne hall, it's okay, because there's enough other things to see in this area. The next day, I took a tour guide. Again, this is a similar way of doing it here in Phnom Penh, where you find somebody, or actually usually somebody finds you, and for $5 or $6, they show you around on their moped. So this particular young man was my tour guide the whole time, because he was likable. Man, actually, he was going to quit and become a Buddhist monk. This is apparently not very uncommon. And the reason why it's done isn't because of really religious reasons, it's because more of economic. Becoming a Buddhist monk means that you get free food and free clothing and free shelter. And he said that's kind of common, that a lot of young men might do that, become a monk, not solely because of religious reasons. But he gave me a nice tour. And it was a very odd tour, though. The first place that we went to is called the Parachute Headquarters. This is basically, it looks like an army complex or a military complex, and they must have some kind of agreement with the government, because you can go into this military complex and shoot off just about anything you want. I shot off an AK-47, and I threw a grenade into a lake. But you could do a lot more than that. They give you, like, it's weird, it's almost like a menu, actually, of all these different things you can shoot off: AK-47s, M16s, you can shoot handguns off, you can shoot, actually the biggest thing that you could shoot is a missile launcher, and you can actually shoot a missile launcher at a cow for $200, a real live cow. But I decided not to do that. I stayed with just the AK-47 and the hand grenade. This was located in the western part of the city. Farther south in the southwest, really more on the outskirts of town, is the area called the Killing Fields. This is kind of a shock going from Parachute Headquarters to the Killing Fields. As you walk into the Killing Fields, you see a large stupa that has all the many of the heads or the skulls of the victims of Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge. This was actually found, these mass graves were found I believe in 1980, and some 8,985 remains were found here in 86 graves, and another 43 graves were just left alone. You can see the mass graves. They're labeled. You can see the areas where the Khmer Rouge basically beat babies' heads against trees. So it's not a very easy thing to look at. And in the stoop of the skulls are arranged demographically, so you have males and females separated, and then by age also, and there's some of the garments, the old clothing, are underneath the skulls. And what makes it more odd is that you can hear, there must be a primary school located, because you can hear young children in the background, probably not too far away, just laughing and giggling, and then you look at this, and it's a bit difficult to watch. And another thing that really struck me is I was walking around, and I had bent over to tie my shoe, and I was going to pick, I thought it was a white stone out of the ground, and I picked it out, and it was actually a tooth. So I think some of it isn't, like I said, they haven't totally cleaned it up even, and some of it washes up, I believe, with the heavy rains. So this is a difficult thing to look at. The rain, we don't really know how many people actually died, but it's somewhere between, the numbers are 2 to 3 million out of a population of 10 million. And another odd thing actually is to see every guest house or hotel you stay at, they always say, oh, we have a movie that we can show you. And it's The Killing Fields, it's about 15, 20 years old now, but it's based on this. And again, that's not an easy movie to watch either, but it seems like that's like the only movie about Cambodia, Hollywood movie about Cambodia. So each place shows you it. I saw it 5 or 6 different times, and but it's a good movie, and I suggest seeing it if you've never seen it before. The next place that we went to is the S-21 prison. This was actually a secondary school before Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge came, and he turned it into a prison. And there's 4 main buildings here, and 2 are museums and 2 are barracks. This is pretty much left the way it was, though, when the Vietnamese came in '79 and got rid of Pol Pot. The only thing that they've really done is put up some of the pictures and then buried some of the severely mangled humans that were still there. The first place is a barracks, and it says the security regulations for the prison. The second place is more of a museum. This shows the pictures of several of the Khmer people that were beaten, including pregnant women. And then the next place is another barracks, and it's 3 different levels. And the first level was the wooden barracks, and then you had more concrete. And then the third level is just an open area where people were shackled. And when I was inside looking out, one of the things that struck me was that how beautiful kind of the courtyard is and how sunny it is outside. And it's only 10 feet away or whatever, but you'll never make it out. Most people there probably had that feeling. And the last building is also probably a difficult one to look at. This shows all the ways that people were people were killed and beaten. And a lot of what was used were farming equipment, I guess, like hoes and things like that. I'm not sure if you're familiar with what Pol Pot was trying to do, but he was basically trying to turn this into an agrarian society. Basically move out everybody from the city out to the farming, to the rural area, to make it a farming society. And he started with foreigners first, Vietnamese, etc. Then he moved on to intellectuals. Basically anyone with glasses was killed. And that's why by the end, 1979, there's so few doctors there. They're either killed or they're scared to admit they're a doctor because they knew they would be killed. And then it just kind of continued on and on until we had a couple million people dying. Probably the most famous thing within this area, there's paintings where you see basically soldiers throwing up babies and bayoneting them. Some graphic paintings like that, but then there's also a skull, and it shows the map of Cambodia, the outline of Cambodia. It's probably one of the more famous ones. Leaving there, my guy took me to the Russian market. This is pretty interesting to look at. This shows all the different foods, actually. as a food market. I just ate fruit there because it seemed to be a bit unsanitary, but it was interesting to see all the different kind of foods in Cambodia at this market. And then he dropped me off right next to the royal palace. There's a small walkway, I guess, and this was a good place to just kind of relax. It was a bit of an emotional day seeing what I had seen that day. It was very difficult, and just a place to relax. And this particular area isn't very highly populated during the day, but at night it really becomes the center for life in Phnom Penh. Many of the locals come out here and just kind of visit with each other, and some of the tourists, there's kind of more well-to-do hotels and restaurants that they stay by. Then the next day, the driver came back and he decided to take me to Udong, which is where the capital was. And there's several temples of the royal tombs of Udong, and this was the This was the capital until 1866. And there's really several temples and palaces that you could see. It was pretty well lined with different temples and palaces that you could see. One of the ones that I thought was kind of interesting was basically, well, there's two new ones on the way back that he showed me. One that I thought was interesting. These are called the new temples, basically. It was built in 1999, so these are pretty recent. But one where there was two lines of like 40 people on each side, and they're holding a big snake, and one with the happy faces, and the other side was the mad faces. And another temple that he showed me that was on the top of a hill, also one of the new temples, was one where basically he said it was he called it the subway system here in Cambodia, but you can't fit trains through it or any vehicles. It's a human subway system where you can go down here, and he said you could walk all the way back to Phnom Penh, which is 40 kilometers. So I'm not sure if you can really do that. He said it would take a couple days. That's about 25 miles. So I then left Cambodia and made it to a different country with a better road system, and that was Vietnam. Again, I could tell where Cambodia ended and Vietnam started just because of the roads. And we made it through immigration, and we had to basically bribe them. They asked for a small bribe to get in. They had some trumped-up thing that we're trying to bring in fresh fruit or something like that. But they did it to all the tourists, and it was just like 50 cents or whatever. But we made it into Ho Chi Minh City, which actually nobody really calls Ho Chi Minh City. Everybody calls it Saigon. The only people that would call it Ho Chi Minh City are the government officials. That's just for legal purposes, but most people call it Saigon. And the first place I go in Saigon is called the Revolutionary Museum. This is divided into two sections. One's the French section, the Resistance versus France, which ended in 1954 when the French, in the 1950s when the French gave up, and then the U.S. resistance to the U.S. And I thought it was kind of interesting to see some of the photographs. One was showed the effects of pot smoking American hippies and how that was a negative effect to Vietnamese culture. And the other things, such as they showed all these different weapons, basically all the bombs that the U.S. had dropped on the Vietnamese, and then they changed these. They took the metal and changed them into different weapons. One of the things that I found interesting in Vietnamese is the word censorship and propaganda. These are usually have negative connotations here in the U.S., but it wasn't really. They were used quite a bit in Vietnamese, and it didn't seem like they had negative connotations. Like when I mailed something back to the U.S., it took me about an hour. There's a lot of red tape, and I had to stand in 8 different lines, and one of the lines was called the mail censorship line. And basically they just take everything out and look over everything, and if there's something they don't like, they'll take it. Now, there's nothing that they didn't like about mine. Mine were just kind of tourist souvenirs, but censorship didn't seem like a bad thing. And even at these museums, they have like literature, like Ho Chi Minh literature, and said this is propaganda used by Ho Chi Minh. So it didn't seem like a negative thing. But anyways, back to the trip. Chait Emperor Pagoda is the next place I went to. This is built by the Cantonese 100 years ago, and this is part Taoist and part Buddhist. Jade Emperor is in the main gallery, and he monitors who enters into heaven. And there's two keepers on either side of him, one with a light like a flashlight, and the other with an axe, and you can kind of tell by what they're holding which one's on which side. And besides that, there's other side temples to look at, and it was really just doused with incense. It was a strong smell, but it was very interesting to go through. The next place I went to it's called the War Remnants Museum now, but it used to be called the American War Atrocities Museum before the U.S. normalized relationships with Vietnam under the Clinton administration. So they changed it to the War Atrocities or War Remnants Museum, which is a little bit more positive connotation. But outside of the buildings, they have a 28-ton howitzer and a Douglas Skyraider plane, and there's a couple other of these bigger planes and tanks outside. Inside, there's a series of pictures. There's 4 or 5 different areas that you can see. Many of the pictures show how the Vietnamese were hurt during this war. And kind of the most striking to me was the area that showed the effects of chemical warfare. One talked about Agent Orange, and some others had pictures about including napalm burns. And what was most striking to me was they actually have malformed fetuses in pickling jars. You can see, and they still keep them here, and that really kind of goes straight to the point, I guess, about chemical weapons. There's another one that depicted the worldwide anti-war movement versus the U.S. during the Vietnamese War. And there's several other pictures. Again, they all had captions in it, which I don't think was necessary, and I thought the captions were at times incorrect. One picture that stands out to me is a American soldier holding what was left of a Vietnamese man. He was decapitated, and there's about half of him left. But the caption says an American GI smiles at his prey or something like that, where it really looked like the GI was kind of grimacing, and I don't think those captions were necessary. All you did do was look at the picture and you got the idea. It hit home enough to get the idea. But we left there, and then I went to an area there's many statues of Ho Chi Minh, and there's one in the central area that I was sitting in front of, and this happens a lot where you have people selling coconuts. And this young woman was selling me coconuts, and she was telling me she works 14-hour days every day. And it looked very heavy, the coconuts, so I did buy a couple coconuts for her. The next day, we went to the Cu Chi tunnels. Now, this is something that was also very interesting to me. These were the tunnels that the VC hit against when they were fighting against the Americans. This was actually first built in the 1940s when they were fighting the French. Originally, they were just one level deep, but due to the Agent Orange that the U.S. dropped on them, they made it as deep as 4 levels so they could get away from this chemical warfare from the chemicals. And they built some 250 kilometers worth of tunnels around the Saigon area. And these tunnels were sometimes only 80 centimeters by 80 centimeters wide, 80 centimeters wide by 80 centimeters long. They actually increased it by 50% for tourists now. It's a tourist attraction now. But it's still a pretty thin area to go through. And actually, one of the entrances you have to kind of drop down into the entrance. And there was a little bit heavier tourist that wanted to go in there. I had trouble myself fitting into it. It was kind of tight against my waist. But a heavier man wanted to get in there, and we kind of said no. But he went down anyways, and he got stuck. And they had to go and basically come from a different entrance hole and unbutton his pants and belt and take his pants off. And that's the only way he could get out. So it's still a bit of a tight fit. And if you have claustrophobia, you shouldn't go through here. And actually, there's a stretch after 100 meters. If you don't feel comfortable, they built a way to get out of it if you don't feel okay. But they also showed us the different offices. Basically, there were different buildings they had underground, including meeting rooms, dorms, hospitals, and a kitchen. they cooked usually at 3 in the morning, which is before the raid started, the U.S. raid started. So the smoke from cooking wouldn't alert the Americans to where they were. And the dirt that was from these tunnels were basically put into where the B-52 bombs were dropped, the big holes there, and then the normal soil was put over the top, and that's how they got rid of the soil. And there's also air holes that let out so they can get oxygen in here so they could breathe. Also interesting on this trip was they showed us the booby traps that were set up near the entrance points. And the booby traps basically were set up not really to kill the Americans, but really just to maim them, to hurt them really, to really hurt them, so that when they went back to the platoon, that they would talk about how horrible this was, and if the person was dead, they couldn't say how bad it was, and this would dissuade other Americans from going down there. And they set it up through either bamboo sticks or metal, but there's different bamboo or different booby traps. One where your foot would just get stuck in it, a second where it would come to your sides, on your sides, second in your chest, and a door trap which would just hit you right in the face. And it's something obviously you don't want to, wouldn't want to get hit by. The next day was a Mekong Delta trip. This is something I could even see in Cambodia. You could tell the Mekong runs down through Cambodia and down starts in Laos, actually, down in Cambodia and down to Vietnam. We went to Mai Tho, which is a nearby city, and then we took a trip. They had played some music for us with kind of like a steel guitar, actually, Vietnamese steel guitar, or a similar sound somewhat. And they played the old acquaintance, the New Year's Eve song for us. That's the only one that I recognized. Actually, they had other traditional ones that I didn't recognize. And the boats were a combination of motorized and paddle boats. It was dependent on the depth of the water. Depending on that is how we traveled. The first place we went to was a honey farm, and you get some honey. And the second place was a coconut. This is kind of similar to what I said in Bangkok, but they explain this much more, how the coconut process worked. And some of the old coconuts actually were dried and used for fuel. They just burn it, and that's what cooked it up. This particular coconut was made for candy, and they showed us the process of how the liquid was extracted and how the whole process went. There's also, you can buy like utensils that were made out of coconut. So it's a little bit more interesting than the other trip that I had in Bangkok to the coconut farm. And then I took a bus. You can actually take a bus to Hanoi for $25, and it's kind of a neat process from Ho Chi Minh City to Hanoi. It's $25, and you can stop at 5 or 6 different cities. And if you want to just bypass the city, you just keep going. But it's Saigon, Dalat, Nha Trang, Hoi An, Hue, and then Hanoi. And it's a pretty good value to do it this way. So I went to Dalat, which is the next city. And Dalat was one of the few cities that was left unbombed during the war. So it's still pretty much intact, and it's up and kind of more in the hills, so it's a little bit cooler. There's a central market. It's located in a fairly unattractive city, or in unattractive building, but walking around the market's pretty interesting. Markets are usually fairly interesting. And then we went to Den 3, which is where Emperor Bao died. That's his summer palace between elephant slaughtering sessions. I was there from 1933 to 38. They also, I thought was kind of interesting, had a mini Eiffel Tower built here. Of course, this was a French colony until the 1950s. And there's also a big lake where a lot of the attractions are. Next place we went to was Nha Trang, which is the next city. And this is located right on the South China Sea. And the reason why you go here is to lay on the beach, and that's what I did. I just missed a monsoon by a day or two, actually. This is like a real monsoon that actually killed people. On the bus ride, if I would have took a bus up from Nha Trang to Hoi An a day before, which I had planned on doing, but I had hurt my foot really bad, so I delayed it a day. Actually, on that bus trip, I was talking to other tourists. There was a car that got swept away basically by monsoon, and there's people that died. So it's a good idea of how rainy it was here, how impressive those monsoons are. But basically what we stopped, besides laying on the beach, I also ate we went to restaurants and went to a lot of bars here in Nha Trang. I had been traveling with the same people that I met with in Saigon, and they were always impressed by how much I could eat. So they filmed it. I started with soup, and then the next thing I ate was boar, and then I had shrimp, and then we had turtle doves. There's not really too much meat on turtle doves. That's not a very good value, but there's also eels, and I tried many different things in Vietnam. It was all good food. I really enjoyed the food. As we walked to the next bar, I had kind of befriended a guy from New Zealand who showed us the warrior dance, which is apparently what they do before all the rugby games in New Zealand. But then we went to the next bar, and this is I guess what you'd call a normal tourist bar in Southeast Asia. And the tourist bars are all tourists, and then the local women. Yeah, and the local women are working, basically. And this is pretty typical, like I said. And one of the things with Vietnam is you can't take a Western man can't take a Vietnamese woman home to his hotel. It's illegal. And so they have areas where you can go with them. But it's a bit of a risky business. I did hear about a tourist that left with a Vietnamese woman, and she drove him into the area, and he was basically attacked, and they took all his money. But this is something that's kind of interesting about Southeast Asia. As far as relaxation, I think Thailand has famous for its massages, I guess. Some are legitimate and some aren't legitimate. And even in Vietnam, it was difficult. I wanted a true legitimate, just a back rub. And it was difficult to get a true back rub because they were basically prostitutes. And this brings us to the freedom tip for today. And it's talking about relaxation. And I don't advocate going to these kind of massage parlors, but in the U.S., most Americans now work over 2,000 hours a year. And you can do the math, but that actually is number one ahead of the Japanese, who were number one. It's almost 600 hours more than what the Germans work, who work around 1,400. An average German works 1,400. So I do encourage you to, in your own way, relax and try to work less and actually relax and enjoy your life. Enjoy your kids if you have kids. Something very simple, just taking a walk around the lake. It doesn't have to be relaxation like the relaxation I'm talking about here in Southeast Asia. But back to the trip, we go up to Hoi An next. That's the next city on the tour. And this is a pretty enjoyable place. I liked Hoi An, even though I only stayed a day. I stopped at the Japanese covered bridge, which is a tourist attraction. This was rebuilt several times since it was first constructed in the mid-16th century. There's 4 statues here, 2 dogs and 2 monkeys, and it represents the year of the dog, the start of the year of the dog, going through the end of the year of the monkey. So it's kind of a historical building. There's several Chinese assembly halls and merchant houses in Hoi An, and this is really known as a marketplace or a textile place. This is a place if you want to get a really nice suit, you can go here and get it really cheap because of the people that work here are really good tailors. I also stopped at the Tran family chapel. This shows 13 generations or some 300 years of people in Hanoi, of this family in Hanoi. And there's family portraits along with an oblong wooden funerary boxes. The next city I visited was Hue. This was the capital from 1802 to 1945. The NVA held this for 25 days in 1968, and during the Tet Offensive, the counterattack nearly leveled the city. But the main place to see is the Citadel. Out of 148 original buildings, 20 survive. And there's some 10 gates through this wall, through the outside wall, and you'll see a second moat and a second defensive wall that guard the imperial city. And this imperial city looks somewhat similar to what I saw in Beijing later. These are a series of palaces and pavilions of red and gold. The most important probably is the Tai Ho Palace of 1833, which has a throne room in it. The next place I visited was the DMZ. It was a DMZ tour. And on this, the first place I visited is called the Rock Pile. This is home of a big battle in the Vietnamese War. Next was a village of local people, and then to Khe Sanh, which is also another big battle. If you ever heard the song Born in the USA by Bruce Springsteen. He mentions it here. This is a huge battle where they were trying to cut off the Ho Chi Minh Trail. All that's left now is a bunch of burnt out tanks and coffee plantations. And then we moved north past the actual area where the DMZ was, and then doubled back to Hue. And then I was on to Hanoi, my last stop in Vietnam. This is, of course, the capital. I started off looking through the Army Museum, which is a pretty good historical museum. And then this was in the French Quarter. Then I went to the Hon Kim district. There's a lake called Hon Kim where this is a central area. It only takes about 30 minutes to walk around this lake, but it's where a lot of people visit, both locals and tourists. Inside the lake is a tortoise tower, or they're called the Lake of the Restored Sword. This is where in the 15th century Leroy, his sword was swallowed by a tortoise, and that's the story behind the tortoise tower. And across a small bridge hooked up with the tortoise tower is a 14th century building where Tran Hung Dao defeated the Mongols in 1288. One of the things that struck me are, this of course is a communist country, and there's signs located around that still talk about the greatness of communism. The next place I visited is, speaking of communism, is Ho Chi Minh's residence. This was built in 1954. It's a very modest house, small house, that is the traditional stilt house design. There's also a chance to see Ho Chi Minh in his mausoleum, but I couldn't see it because in October and November he's getting his face redone, and I was there in November, so I couldn't see him. But close by to that is the one-pillar pagoda. This was built in the 11th century and resembles a lotus blossom, which is the Buddhist symbol of enlightenment, and the name one-pillar pagoda is because it is located on just one pillar. Finally, around West Lake, I see the B-52 Museum. This is one of 23 B-52s that was shot down in December of '72 during the Christmas bombing. It lays half submerged in a small lake, basically. It's a very simple monument. And the last thing I see in Hanoi is the water puppet show. This is interesting in that it's very traditional as a way that the Vietnamese entertain themselves. This is basically, they're out in the rice paddies, and they use these puppets in the water as a way to entertain themselves. And the water puppets now are made out of dragons and different kind of animals and humans. And I kept on looking up for strings, but they're actually controlled below the water by sticks. And there's people behind kind of like a wall that are half up to their waist in water that are controlling the puppets during the puppet show. So that's something I really enjoyed, something totally different than I've ever seen before. So that wrapped up my trip to Southeast Asia, all three countries, Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam. And that will take us to China and the Far East, which will be part 9 of our series.